The Declaration of Independence, of course, is when we declared our separation from England, but Constitution Day is when we'd already had one system of government and it hadn't quite worked on our own, and we decided to change it and make it better. And that making it better is one of the reasons I selected my personal favorite founding father, and that's Gouverneur Morris. There's a book about Gouverneur Morris called Gentleman Revolutionary, the rake who wrote the Constitution. The reason he is my favorite is because of the preamble itself. He is the individual who drafted the preamble. Those are his words. And they begin, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union." And I think that captures what America is more than anything else. Not that it is more perfect than anything before, but that it seeks to be continually more perfect. It cannot achieve perfection, but it seeks ever toward justice, to move forward, to create more freedom, to be a better society, a more democratic society, one in which the people are sovereign. And those were his words at that time. I also like him because he was a bit of a cad. He was known as a ladies' man. He had an interesting life. When he was in France, he served as both the replacement for statues of George Washington, because he was quite tall, but he had a peg leg. He had a single leg and a wooden leg. And the reason he had that wooden leg was he had an accident falling out of a carriage one day in Philadelphia while he was on an assignation with a woman who happened to be somebody else's wife. The great irony is you can go to that location on Dock Street. It's a beautiful location with cobblestones, and lots of married couples have their wedding pictures taken there. But the Constitution itself is the document that created our country. And we're here to celebrate and learn about that today, and I'm here to welcome you. Thank you all for being here. And let's begin with a brief Pledge of Allegiance, and then I'll move on to the other speakers. Please put your hands over your heart. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now to keep us on schedule, I'm going to hand the mic over to Anthony Pennay.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tony Pennay, and I'm the director of the Walter and Lenore Annenberg Presidential Learning Center here at the Reagan Foundation. And on behalf of our team at the Foundation and the Library and the Museum, I'd like to welcome you. I want to thank our partners in planning today's event, Christian Lindke and the Arslan program, who are funding the generous teacher stipends today. Thank you very much, Christian. Maria Gallo and the Center for Civic Education. Damon Huss and the Constitutional Rights Foundation. And of course, the indomitable force of nature that is Michelle Herczog, Queen of the Social Studies. And I also want to thank my team here at the Foundation who's put everything together today, all the logistics and stuff. Everything that goes right and is wonderful and that you like is entirely their responsibility. Anything that goes wrong is my fault, so please come talk to me. I accept it. I also want to encourage you to talk to our exhibitors. If you are going to sign up for one of the Discovery Center sessions this afternoon, you do need to register. There's a sign-in sheet. Colleen over there is raising her hand. You need to sign up because we have a limited amount of spaces for those. It's really fun. And I also want to mention another simulation that is starting up this year. Our friends on the National Archives on the federal side have a new Situation Room experience, which you might have heard about. Carol there is holding it up. It involves the actual paneling from the Situation Room that was in the White House from Kennedy up through George W. Bush. So it's really, really cool. I've gone through it. There are still openings, I'm guessing, for this year, correct? So if you want to sign your classes up to come and see that, please stop by and see Carol. I also want to recognize the California Civic Learning Award Schools who are joining us today. So in this room at 10 a.m., you'll have a chance to hear firsthand from the students and teachers who have won some of the most prestigious awards in civic learning here in California. So thank you to Royal High School. I see Royal High School is here, our friends here at Simi Valley. Bellflower, do we have Bellflower here? Bellflower is here. Natomas Pacific Pathways, is Natomas here? I think they win the award for farthest travel. They come all the way down from Sacramento to be here with us today, so thank you very much. And Normandy Avenue Elementary, is Normandy here? Normandy? On their way? Okay, we'll see them. And finally, I want to thank each and every one of the teachers who join us. Thank you for investing. And I want you to note that investing is a very deliberate word choice because you're not giving up a Saturday. I know it's early in the school year. Some of you are only a month in. But you are investing a Saturday to learn from some great scholars, hear from some great schools, and gather the resources of some of the finest educators and civic-focused nonprofits around. So thank you for your dedication to your craft, your students, and for exemplifying what it means to be a professional educator. So give yourselves a nice round of applause. Thanks for all coming out today. So September 17th, 2016 marks the 229th anniversary of the signing of our Constitution, which you know is the oldest such governing document in the democratic world. Judging by the bill from the City Tavern, where the framers gathered on September 15th, 1787 to bid farewell to General Washington as the convention came to a close, the 55 gentlemen in attendance knew they had something to celebrate. One of the things you'll hear about today probably is the importance of using primary source material. So I assure you that I went straight to the source in investigating this and found that George Washington and 54 of his closest friends at this party consumed 54 bottles of Madeira, 60 bottles of claret wine, 22 bottles of porter, 12 bottles of beer, 8 bottles of whiskey, and 7 large bowls. In the source it's spelled bowels, but I believe it was bowls of punch. So using Dimension 4 of the C3 framework, which I'm also sure you will hear about today, which is drawing conclusions, I will now communicate my conclusion to you that it is remarkable that any of the framers made it to the first Constitution Day. Another remarkable tidbit from that night. So the musicians who were providing the entertainment for this rowdy band of framers were Germans. Many of them were Hessians who had actually fought against George Washington in the Revolutionary War. Making your vanquished enemy play music while you consume the modern equivalent of nearly $16,000 worth of wine. Just one of the many reasons why George Washington remains one of the most beloved presidents in the history of our country. Finally, you are here during the final weekend. Originally, we didn't advertise this, but they extended. We have a great exhibit right now, which I encourage you all to see. It's called Vatican Splendors, a journey through faith and art. So with your stickers that you have, your blue stickers that you got during check-in, that will get you into the museum. It will get you into the Vatican exhibit. It will be busy today. We've had 3,500 visitors or so. So I encourage you at some point to stick around after the day to go through and see it. The Constitution itself is kind of a 229-year journey through faith and art. Faith in the power of people to determine their own form of government. And art, because there's an art to democracy, right? You would probably remember Benjamin Franklin famously said that, coming out of the Constitutional Convention, that we had a republic if you can keep it. And if the last 229 years of American history isn't a narrative of the triumphs and failures of the art of keeping it, and isn't each and every one of you in your own way an artist of democracy, practicing each day the art of cultivating the next generation of citizens who will do their best to keep our republic. So on Constitution Day, I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank you for all that you do for your students. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the wonderful Michelle Herczog. Please enjoy your day.
Yes, it is I, the indomitable force of nature. Can I get my name tag changed? I think that was too much. Thank you. Anyway, I just want to do a quick welcome. I'm so thrilled you're here. How many of you have been to Constitution Day before? Awesome. How many first time? How many coming back next year? All hands. Come on. There you go. Cool. Anyway, I just want to join in and thank, this is a wonderful team. If you want to see how partnerships work effectively, you got the dream team here. Maria, stand up too. We start planning this like 10 months in advance, and if it wasn't for Tony and the Reagan Foundation for giving us this wonderful space, for Christian here providing the funding for you to get stipends, for Damon and CRF to do all the registration, for Maria, who's a powerful, also part contributor to this great thing. Those pocket constitutions come from the Center for Civic Education. So the next time you're at a presidential convention, you take that pocket constitution out. Either convention you go to, you're good, right? Okay. So real quickly, I just want to point out some stuff. You also should receive a free copy of this fabulous DVD and curriculum Electoral Dysfunction from Bennett Singer. This is an award-winning thing. Take some and take some extras. You're going to hear later about our new history social science framework. We have State Board Vice President Eileen Strauss coming and Stephanie Gregson. Be sure you pick up these materials. There's other things out there. I won't go into detail, but I do also want to genuinely thank the wonderful assistance from my LA County Office of Education. Our Assistant Director Danielle Mitchell is here. Wave, Danielle. Do the Queen wave. There she goes. Her son is here helping. Mindy Keller here. Stacy Boyd. They're out there with registration. And her husband Jim. So this really is a group effort. We have Marshall Crotty here, who's president of Constitutional Rights Foundation. So you got the star power in the room. Be sure at the end of the day you complete this yellow evaluation and leave it on your way out. Be sure you also sign out at the registration table, because that will ensure and give us proof that you are here so that we can then issue the stipends to you, which are going to take some time. Don't call me tomorrow saying, where's my check? It'll give us about 4 to 6 weeks, right, Damon? All right, so just be calm on that. Anyway, I'm glad you're here. Thank you to my wonderful friends and partners. And I'm dropping it. Let me turn over Damon, who's going to kick us off with this wonderful speaker to start our day. So thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And briefly, I'm just going to make one housekeeping announcement, and that is, for those of you who signed in on the list outside, that's great. For those of you who, for one reason or another, you didn't see your name on the list, just be sure that after we hear our speaker this morning, we can clear up all the registration issues after that. And I have these on-site registration forms, which will help us, track you down in our records a little bit later. I hope that didn't sound too ominous, track you down in our records. But just see me after this. I'll be, after our speaker this morning, I'll be in the registration area, and we can take care of that. And speaking of our speaker, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker this morning. He is Rick Hasen, and he is the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California at Irvine Law School. We're really fortunate in this election season to have a nationally recognized expert on election law come and speak with us. His topic this morning is going to be, is called After Scalia, and it's the future of American election law. So in addition to the election this year, of course, we also experienced the passing of one of our associate justices on the Supreme Court, Antonin Scalia. And so we'll be hearing about that and the ramifications of that and what the prospects are from Professor Hasen this morning. Very briefly, a little bit of his background. He got his Bachelor of Arts degree, put on my reading glasses here, Bachelor of Arts degree in Middle Eastern Studies from UC Berkeley, and at UCLA, his Master of Arts and PhD in Political Science, as well as his law degree. He's also the founding editor of the Election Law Journal. It's a peer-reviewed journal on election law, and is also the founder and the writer and manager at the Election Law blog, which is one of my go-to sources for anything related to elections and what's happening not only in national elections, but also state and local elections, really interesting things happening in the law there. He's widely published in law reviews, peer-reviewed law journals. But you might have also read articles by him in Slate Online or the Daily Beast or even op-eds in the New York Times. And I do have his newest book. He's published several books. His newest one this year is called Plutocrats United, and it's on campaign money, the Supreme Court, and the distortion of American elections. I've been reading this, and it really is enlightening about what is happening and dispels some myths and also goes well into the history of the Supreme Court cases that we know about related to campaign finance. But you need to hear more from him and not from me. So I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Rick Hasen to talk with us this morning, and with that, I will invite him to the stage. Thank you very much.
We can work. The computer will help me get my slides going here. Thank you, Damon. And I've got some. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. Beautiful Reagan Library. I've spoken here before, but not to this group, and it's really a testament to you that you'd come out on a Saturday morning to hear about the inner workings of the Supreme Court and its cases involving our elections and our democracy. And so the topic of my talk today is after Scalia, the future of United States election law. And as you know, in February 2016, Justice Scalia, who was an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, passed away. He was a brilliant, bombastic, conservative jurisprudence, and his death provides an opportunity to reflect on how the ideological views of members of the Supreme Court have shaped elections and campaign rules in the United States for many decades. His death reveals that the replacement of even one justice on a closely divided Supreme Court can flip national rules for American elections by 180 degrees. Thank you. I'm afraid this is the only picture that you'll see on this presentation. So, the court's decisions in the election area have affected everything from the role of money in elections to the rules for drawing legislative districts, to the proper judicial response for partisan manipulation of voting rules. One case in which Justice Scalia was in the majority even helped decide a disputed presidential election, the 2000 presidential election, which culminated in the famous case of Bush versus Gore. Justice Scalia wrote strong opinions in divided election cases, stating that limits on corporate spending in elections worked as unconstitutional censorship, that courts do not have judicially manageable tools to decide when partisan legislators take too much self-interest into account when they draw legislative districts, and that state governments should have a mostly free hand in crafting election rules, even when the rules may be chosen for partisan reasons and when they may severely burden a small number of voters. He also controversially defended the end of the vote counting in the 2000 election. His conservative positions stand in stark contrast with the more liberal positions that have emerged in election cases, that courts should defer to legislatures on the need to limit money in politics, that courts have the power and the tools to limit partisan excesses in redistricting, and that courts should police cutbacks in voting rights, which may burden voters and may be unjustified by any important state interests. Justice Scalia expressed his views with wit, intellect, sarcasm, and force, crafting rhetorically effective opinions which nonetheless usually fail to capture the votes of even one of his liberal colleagues. With his death and with the potential replacement by a more liberal justice, many of the positions he espoused could soon be repudiated, and many of the rules for regulating politics in the United States could change dramatically. Whether or not Justice Scalia's positions endure on the Supreme Court, his views provide a benchmark against which we can judge the liberal and conservative approaches to law and politics and understand the intersection of constitutional election law jurisprudence and real power in the coming decades. So I'm going to consider the state of American election law through the lens of Justice Scalia, looking at money in politics, partisan gerrymandering, and election administration through three major opinions that Justice Scalia was involved in: Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce, Veith versus Jubellerer, and Crawford versus Marion County. I'll spend a few minutes at the end talking about Bush versus Gore, the decision that ended the 2000 election. I'm going to suggest that there are dangers ahead for American democracy and for the Supreme Court's legitimacy, given the current combination of a Supreme Court with great power over our election rules and the court's new division among the justices, not just on ideological lines, but now also along party lines. We should expect to see election rules shift at a partisan Supreme Court, raising concerns about our American democracy. So let me start with the question of money in politics. Perhaps the most controversial opinion of the United States Supreme Court in recent years, under the leadership of Chief Justice John Roberts, has been his 2010 opinion in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. The court in Citizens United held that business corporations have a constitutional right under the United States Constitution's First Amendment to spend unlimited sums to help elect or defeat candidates to office. After Citizens United and after other court and administrative decisions, we've seen the emergence of so-called super PACs and other groups in which you could take unlimited money from wealthy individuals, corporations, and others to fund election ads, And it has led to an explosion of outside money, money being spent not by candidates or political parties in our elections. For those who don't pay close attention to the Supreme Court, Citizens United might have seemed like a bolt out of the blue. But the campaign finance issue had been dividing the Supreme Court for decades. In fact, Justice Scalia and Justice Anthony Kennedy had been fighting over these rules ever since they dissented in a 1990 decision called Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce. These justices were patient. And once Justice O'Connor left the Supreme Court in 2006, they were finally able to put together a majority to overturn the Austin case in Citizens United. So let me talk about the Austin case for a few minutes. Austin concerned a Michigan state campaign finance law, not a law regulating federal elections, but even though these federal rules don't apply to state and local elections, and each state sets its own rules, Michigan's law was pretty much in line with federal law on this question. Michigan said that if you were a corporation, business corporation, you couldn't spend money that you generated by selling shoes or selling software and use it for election-related activities. Instead, you could set up a separate committee called a Political Action Committee or a PAC. That committee could take money from executives and shareholders and use it for political activities. But you couldn't take your general treasury funds and spend them on election ads. Although Michigan's law barred most corporations from spending money on these ads, it did not prevent media corporations, like a corporation that runs a newspaper or a TV or radio station, and that's engaged in news and commentary, from spending their funds on the ads. Further, unlike the federal law, which limited both what corporations and unions could do, the Michigan law only limited what corporations could do. In Austin, on a 6-3 vote, the Supreme Court held that Michigan's law did not violate the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech and association, and that it was permissible to stop corporations from taking money they made selling shoes or software and using it for political activities. In an earlier case called Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976, the Supreme Court had held that the First Amendment prevented the Congress from limiting the amount that an individual could spend on elections. The court held that limits on independent spending were a great infringement on the First Amendment, the rights of free speech and association, and that under the court's so-called strict scrutiny review, the government could only limit an individual spending money if it could be shown that there was a compelling interest to do so and that the interest was narrowly tailored to further that interest. Although the court in Buckley held that preventing corruption, the appearance of corruption, could serve that interest, the court said that independent spending limits could not be justified by an interest in preventing corruption. The court reasoned that if the spending is truly independent, there would be no chance for bribery and no chance for influence. And so an individual spending limit was unconstitutional because there was no connection between these two individuals, the independent spender and the candidate. Further, in Buckley, the court rejected the idea that you could limit money in politics, an individual, a billionaire who wants to spend money in politics, on the interest in leveling the playing field. The court said the idea that you would try to achieve equality by limiting the amount that people could spend on elections was, quote, wholly foreign to the First Amendment. Like Buckley, Austin involved a spending limit. But while Buckley concerned spending limits for individuals, Austin concerned spending limits for business associations. And in Austin, the court held that the limit on corporate spending satisfied strict scrutiny. Rather than find that the rules were allowed to stop bribery like corruption, the Austin court held that Michigan's law could be justified by what it called a, quote, different kind of corruption in the political arena, the corrosive and distorting effects of immense aggregations of wealth that are accumulated with the help of the corporate form and that have little or no correlation to the public support for the corporation's political ideas. Although the court described this interest as a kind of prevention of corruption, it looked more like a concern about equality. The court was letting Michigan limit how much wealthy corporations could spend because they would have disproportionate influence over our elections. The court didn't make the equality point directly, but it was very much in tension with what the court said in Buckley. And this is the point Justice Scalia picked up on in his dissent in Austin. He and Justice Kennedy each dissented. Justice Scalia began his opinion by focusing on what he said was censorship allowed by Michigan's law. He wrote, quote, attention all citizens, to assure the fairness of elections by preventing disproportionate expressions of the views of any single powerful group, your government has decided that the following associations of persons shall be prohibited from speaking or writing in support of any candidate, fill in the blank here. In permitting Michigan to make private corporations the first object of this Orwellian announcement, the court today endorses the principle that too much speech is an evil that the majority can proscribe. In the course of his dissent, Justice Scalia advanced all of the major conservative arguments against campaign finance limits. First, he argued that limiting how much money someone or a person or an entity could spend in elections counts as unconstitutional censorship. Second, he argued that legislatures often pass campaign finance laws to protect incumbents. He said that an incumbent politician who says he welcomes free and fair debate is no more to be trusted than an entrenched monopolist who says he welcomes full and fair competition. He further suggested that the reason that Michigan regulated business corporations but not labor unions was that labor unions in Michigan were a quite powerful political force. Finally, Justice Scalia attacked the law for exempting the press. He thought any special danger of disproportionate corporate power would apply especially to media corporations that produce news stories and commentaries and not to other provisions. Justice Scalia did not use this argument about the press to argue that the press should be limited like other corporations. Instead, he argued that the press could be the next entity that the government sought to target with regulation. And he believed that not only should press corporations be allowed to spend whatever they want, but all corporations should be allowed to spend what they want. His solution was deregulation, allowing all corporations to spend whatever they want on elections. Between 1990 and 2010, Justice Scalia consistently argued that all spending limits in elections violate the First Amendment. But until Citizens United, he could not find 4 other votes to make his views a majority view. In fact, in a 2003 case called McConnell versus Federal Election Commission, the Supreme Court on a 5-4 vote affirmed the Austin case. The Supreme Court's view in McConnell advanced a very different view about the First Amendment and campaign finance than Justice Scalia. To the majority in McConnell, large money flowing into politics raised dangers of corruption and undue influence, even if the money was spent independently. Too much money being spent by those with the greatest wealth could undermine our democracy and the public's faith in our democracy. And rather than worry that these laws were passed to benefit incumbents, the McConnell court believed it was appropriate for the court to defer to elected officials because legislatures with experience running for office had greater expertise than judges in knowing about the dangers of money in politics. McConnell marked a Supreme Court which showed great deference to governments passing restrictive campaign finance laws. In 2006, however, Justice O'Connor retired from the Supreme Court, and she was replaced by Justice Alito. Justice Alito's views on campaign finance are similar to Scalia's. And so by 2010, in the Citizens United case, the position that Justice Scalia had been advocating since 1990 finally came into being when the court overturned Austin and this McConnell case. The court in Citizens United held that Austin's anti-distortion argument was about equality and not corruption, and that under the First Amendment, equality was an impermissible reason to limit money in politics. The Citizens United majority accepted all of Justice Scalia's arguments about the press, about incumbency protection, and about censorship in holding that any limit on money in politics and elections, at least when spent by Americans, violates the First Amendment. The result of Citizens United has been dramatic. Outside spending in U.S. federal elections reached about $1.3 billion in the 2012 elections and could well exceed $2 billion in our current 2016 elections. In the 2012 elections, one couple, Sheldon and Marion Adelson, spent between $98 million and $150 million to try to elect candidates they preferred. In 2014, an environmentalist named Tom Steyer here in California spent $74 million to try to influence the result of Senate races. In 2016, the Libertarian Koch brothers and their alliance pledged to spend up to $900 million, right, close to $1 billion, to try to influence the outcome of our elections. But even with this explosion of outside money and the great rise of the wealthy influencing elections, the issue is not settled. Those who favor fewer limits on money in elections have been bringing more lawsuits, trying to get the court to strike down even more limits. Before Justice Scalia's death, these lawsuits to deregulate money in politics further looked likely to succeed, except on the issue of disclosure. Justice Scalia was perhaps the most outspoken justice in favor of campaign finance disclosure, saying that the First Amendment should not be read to allow anonymous campaign spending. He said that those who try to influence elections should have what he called civic courage, and on this point he had support from both liberal and conservative fellow justices. Justice Thomas notably disagreed, believing in a constitutional right to anonymous campaign finance spending. Now, after Scalia, disclosure laws remain secure, and the question about limits is what's going to happen to Citizens United. The Citizens United dissenters have said that they want to see the case overturned, and Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton has said that if she is elected, she will appoint justices who would overturn Citizens United. A Republican presidential candidate would be expected to appoint a justice like Justice Scalia, and Donald Trump has said that he would do so, although some people question whether he actually would. Absent a constitutional amendment, which is virtually impossible given the current gridlock in the country over issues of money and politics, it's really going to be the Supreme Court that's going to be the last word. And so whoever replaces Justice Scalia will likely be the deciding vote on whether we allow more money in politics or less. All right, I want to turn from money and politics to an issue that's even more obscure, if you can imagine, the question of redistricting, drawing the lines for where people are elected. Justice Scalia raised fears of incumbency protection as a major reason for his skepticism of campaign finance limits, but he was much less concerned about incumbency protection and partisan self-dealing in the two other election areas I'm going to talk about, redistricting and election administration. First, talking about redistricting. The rules regarding legislative districts are so important in the United States because voters choose members of Congress and state legislators and many local election officials using winner-take-all elections in single-member districts. Candidates, not parties, run in elections, and whoever gets the most votes in that district is the winner. If you can draw district lines to define each legislator's territories, it's possible for the legislators to choose the voters rather than the voters to choose the legislature. The term gerrymander comes from a cartoon criticizing districts drawn by a 19th century Massachusetts governor, Elbridge Gerry. The cartoonist depicted the district looking like a salamander, and hence the name gerrymander, and that's where that term comes from. Before the 1960s, Congress and the Supreme Court put few constraints on the ability to draw districts however you wanted. The Supreme Court at first had ruled that the courts couldn't get involved in these questions, but in 1962, the Supreme Court, in a case called Baker versus Carr, a case that Chief Justice Earl Warren said was his most important case when he was on the Supreme Court, held that courts could look at these questions. In later cases, such as Reynolds versus Sims, the court imposed what's called the one-person, one-vote rule and said you need to have rough equality in the districts that you draw. Further, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, as amended in 1982, provides all kinds of protections for minority voters as district lines are drawn. And since the 1990s, thanks to decisions by Justice Scalia and other conservatives on the court has said that when you draw district lines, race cannot be the predominant factor in how the lines are drawn. Yet even with all of these different rules in place, legislators have been quite able to draw districts that favor their own political party and themselves. Ask someone who's in the legislature what their first priority is in terms of how district lines are drawn, and it is, how can I protect my district? And ask them what their second priority is how can I protect my party's districts? So the Supreme Court has repeatedly been asked to get involved to police this so-called partisan gerrymandering. For many decades, people have gone to the Supreme Court raising these claims. In a 1986 case called Davis versus Bandemer, just before Justice Scalia joined the court, the Supreme Court agreed it could hear cases involving partisan gerrymandering. The case involved Indiana districts, and the court held that Indiana's district plans, which benefited Republicans over Democrats, did not constitute a gerrymander, but they set up a standard to judge when something would be an unconstitutional gerrymander. It was such a tough standard to meet that in the 18 years between Bandemer and the 2004 case I'm about to talk about, there was not a single successful challenge under the standard in the entire country. So in the 2004 case out of Pennsylvania called Veith versus Jubilerer, this case involved partisan gerrymandering claim involving congressional districts in the state of Pennsylvania. And if you thought that what the court does is sometimes hard to understand, what the court did in Veith was impossible to understand. The court divided into three groups, 4-1-4. 4 justices, led by Justice Scalia, took the position that courts can't police these partisan gerrymanders, that it's really a political question that the political branches need to deal with. 4 liberal justices on the court took the position that courts should police these things, and here are some standards to judge when taking party into account is too much. This left Justice Kennedy in the middle. Justice Kennedy, what does the Constitution mean? It means what Justice Kennedy had for breakfast. This case is the best illustration of that. Justice Kennedy agreed with the conservatives that, agreed with the liberals, I should say, that the court should be open to hear these claims, but he agreed with the conservatives that every standard that the liberals proposed was wrong, leading to the position that you can keep going to court and you will keep losing if you bring one of these claims, unless you come up with a new standard, not like one of the old standards, that might help us separate partisan gerrymandering from nonpartisan gerrymandering. Justice Scalia took the position that this was he said this, Justice Kennedy's position, his never say never approach was not an available disposition. In other words, according to Justice Scalia, a justice could not both agree that the courts were open for business, but reject every standard to police these things. And perhaps the most interesting aspect of Justice Scalia's opinion, he admitted that partisan gerrymandering could be unconstitutional. He said, yes, extreme partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional. Just like it would be, there are certain things that the Senate could do if it was trying someone for impeachment that would violate the standards for trying impeachments. But he said, this is not a question for the courts. And so he set out this idea that there could be some things that are unconstitutional, but for which the courts can offer no remedy. Since the court decided Veith in 2004, the court has passed up a few opportunities to reconsider the question, or at least for Justice Kennedy to reconsider the question. Is there a standard to decide when taking partisanship has taken partisanship too much into account in drawing district lines? Now, with the death of Justice Scalia and an eventual replacement of him, we could well be in a situation where the court is ready to police partisan gerrymandering. What if the court agrees to police partisan gerrymandering? If the court does so, the results would likely benefit the Democratic Party in the United States, at least in the short term. That's not because Democrats are less interested in gerrymandering. It's because Republicans control more state legislatures and get to do more gerrymandering. So would a rule that limits partisan gerrymandering shift the control of the political power in the House of Representatives? Probably not. A good part of the reason for the Republican advantage in the House of Representatives is natural geographic sorting. Democrats more likely to live in cities, Republicans more likely to live in rural and suburban areas, and so there's a natural geographic advantage for Republicans. But it could have an effect on the number of Democrats and Republicans in each state, as well as for state and local redistricting. State and local redistricting, a rule that says you can't take partisanship too much into account would potentially have major effects. Will the next Supreme Court justice do that? That's really a question that depends in part on who the next president is. All right, the third and final area I want to talk about has to do with voting rights and election administration. In the area of voting rights, the Supreme Court, in a major opinion called Shelby County versus Holder, held that, this was the 5 conservative justices, including Justice Scalia, held over the dissent of the 4 liberal justices that a key part of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional. This provision gave the United States government oversight over certain states and local areas that had a history of racial discrimination in voting. And the Supreme Court said in Shelby County that this special federal oversight was no longer justified and infringed on the sovereignty of these states that were subject to this federal oversight. After Shelby County, we've seen a number of formerly covered states and localities pass new restrictive voting laws. This has led to a number of lawsuits, some of which are working their way up to the Supreme Court over whether these new restrictive laws violate other provisions of the Voting Rights Act, parts that have not yet been overturned by the Supreme Court. The ideological division on the Supreme Court was somewhat less stark in a different case involving election administration by the Roberts Court, a 2008 case called Crawford versus Marion County Election Board. Crawford concerned the constitutionality of a law from Indiana which required voters to produce one of a few acceptable forms of photographic identification for voting. These are the so-called voter ID cases you've probably been hearing a lot about. The United States, of course, has no national identity card, and each state sets its own rules for voting. The case is important because Indiana was one of the first states to adopt strict voter identification requirements following the rise of what I've called the voting wars, fights over the rules for conducting elections, which have heated up after the disputed 2000 presidential election. Roughly speaking, some states with Republican control, such as Indiana, have enacted laws making it harder to register and vote, while some states with Democratic control, like California, have passed laws making it easier to register and vote. Both Democrats and Republicans seem to believe that making registration and voting easier helps elect Democrats because new voters and less regular voters are more likely to vote for Democrats. The Crawford case proceeded without much evidence on both sides. The state could point to no evidence that impersonation fraud, where one person goes to the polling place and pretends to be someone else, was actually a problem. Indeed, the state conceded there were no cases of impersonation fraud in Indiana on record. But the plaintiffs could produce very few eligible voters who wished to vote, lacked the right form of ID, and would have a hard time getting it. And in the Veith case we saw, there was a 4-1-4 split on the Supreme Court. In Crawford, it was 3-3-3. This is what it is to figure out what the Constitution means. It's counting the numbers of justices. When the case made it to the Supreme Court, Justice Stevens, writing for himself, Chief Justice Roberts, and Justice Kennedy rejected what's called a facial challenge to the law, a law that would have thrown it out completely. The Stevens opinion held that most voters can easily produce the right form of voter ID. The law was only a minor burden and justified by important state interests not only in potential voter fraud, but preserving voter confidence. These interests were acceptable, Justice Stevens said, even though the state couldn't point to any evidence of fraud. Justice Stevens said, well, it could be a problem, and he pointed to an 1868 election. However, the Stevens opinion left open the possibility of new lawsuits brought by groups of voters who face significant burdens. These are so-called as-applied challenges. Find a group of voters who have a particular problem getting IDs, maybe they could get an exemption from the laws. And those are the kinds of lawsuits that we've been seeing right now. Now, Justice Scalia, writing for himself, Justice Alito, and Justice Thomas, the three most conservative justices on the Supreme Court, took a different view. Like the Stevens view, he believed the law imposed a little burden on most voters. On this basis, though, Justice Scalia said the law was constitutionally applied against everyone, even if there were some voters who faced significant burdens. He said, he wrote, the Indiana voter identification law is a generally applicable, non-discriminatory voting regulation, and our precedents refute the view that individual impacts are relevant to determining the severity of the burden it imposes. Under this view, even if some voters face severe burdens in getting an ID and being able to vote, these people could be permanently disenfranchised. Consider, for example, evidence from Wisconsin, where there's an ongoing lawsuit. The state Supreme Court there read the state constitution to require the state DMV to assist voters who faced burdens in getting the documents they need to get an identification card. Ongoing litigation against the state accuses the department of refusing to grant an identification card to an otherwise eligible voter who lacked the use of her hands because the voter could not sign the form requesting a waiver. The department refused to accept the signature of her daughter, who had the legal power to sign for her. There was another allegation that an eligible voter in Wisconsin who was born in a German concentration camp during World War II could not get an ID because the person could not track down a birth certificate. Under Justice Scalia's view, these voters would simply be out of luck. Justice Scalia's view in the Crawford case expressed the view that there would be too many lawsuits if states were faced with having to overcome all the burdens for voters. While this possibility bothered Justice Scalia, a third group of voters, the dissenters in this case, took a different view. They believed that because the law burdened some voters severely, it was unconstitutional for all voters. And so they, unlike the Stevens opinion, which would allow just for a special group of voters to get an exemption from the law, or the Scalia opinion, which says no one gets an exemption from the law, they said the whole law should be thrown out. So, Where does that leave us on the question of voter ID? Well, that would leave us with the Stevens opinion as the narrowest controlling opinion, and what we've seen since then have been a number of cases trying to re-argue over the specifics of voter ID laws. And we've now seen cases in Texas, in North Carolina, in Wisconsin, and throughout the country working their way to the Supreme Court. Well, what's happened after Scalia on the question of how these cases have been decided? The most recent case out of North Carolina District Court, with a judge that was appointed by a Republican president, said that North Carolina's strict voting law was perfectly constitutional. The case was appealed to the Fourth Circuit, where 3 Democratic-appointed judges said that the law was unconstitutional and it showed racially discriminatory intent. The case went to the Supreme Court on an emergency basis, and what happened after Justice Scalia? The court divided 4-4. Split. And when the court divides 4-4, 4 liberals, 4 conservatives, then the lower court ruling stands. This is an election with a shorthanded Supreme Court where the Court of Appeals have become the new Supreme Court. They're the ones that stand. Finally, let me say a few words about Bush versus Gore, one of the most famous opinions of the last generation. Likely the most controversial ruling of the Supreme Court while Justice Scalia served on it was the 2000 case of Bush versus Gore. The case arose out of an extremely close presidential election between Republican George W. Bush and Democrat Al Gore over who was entitled to the electoral votes from the state of Florida, whose electoral votes determined the outcome of the presidential election. Some of you are probably old enough to remember that. In Bush versus Gore, elsewhere, I've described the long and protracted litigation battle between the parties, the broad decentralization and localization of American election administration, and the role that partisan election officials play in deciding how to handle Gore's request to get recounts of some ballots, and the controversial decisions of both the Florida Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court, which ultimately stopped the recount of such ballots and led to Bush's victory. In Bush versus Gore, the court divided 5-4 into conservative and liberal camps, with conservatives voting to stop the recount and liberals voting to allow the recount. Stopping the recount left Bush already ahead, winning Florida's crucial electoral votes and the presidency. The 5 most conservative justices, including Justice Scalia, held in an unsigned opinion that inconsistent standards for judging the intent of the voters, if you remember the so-called hanging chads and the guy holding up the paper, that this violated the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution's 14th Amendment. Different counties and different election judges within counties used varying and inconsistent standards in deciding what markings on ballots would count as a valid vote for a candidate. According to the Bush versus Gore majority, once the Florida legislature gave Florida voters the right to vote for president, the state, quote, may not, by later and arbitrary and disparate treatment, value one person's vote over that of another. Although 1 or 2 of the more liberal dissenting justices accepted this equal protection theory, the rest did not, and all of the dissenting justices agreed that if there was a constitutional problem with Florida's rules for counting these ballots, the case should have been sent back to the Florida courts for more counting. The remedy for the dissenters was to not stop the counting. The decision was controversial for many reasons, including the fact that the conservative majority on the Supreme Court adopted a liberal reading of the Equal Protection Clause to expand voting rights, while the liberals on the court adopted a narrow reading of the Equal Protection Clause which refused to expand voting rights, flipping the usual positions of both sides. Given their ideological commitments, we would have expected the opposite. And people ask, what would the case have been if it was Gore versus Bush? The role reversal underscored the suggestion that the justices were motivated, no doubt subconsciously, there was my Freudian slip, by their preference over who should be the next president than over a neutral examination of the Constitution's requirements. In the years since the Bush versus Gore decision, Justice Scalia often faced questions about it in his many public appearances. Scalia would often simply tell Democrats and others disappointed with the decision to, quote, get over it. But partisans on both sides continued to debate the controversial decision. Should another disputed presidential election come before the Supreme Court, things could be even more partisan and divided than they were in 2000, during the Bush versus Gore time. Back in 2000, two of the Republican-appointed justices, Souter and Stevens, were considered liberals and dissented in the case. This means that when the court divided along ideological lines in Bush versus Gore, it didn't also divide along party lines. Today, however, with the replacement of Justice Scalia and other justices, all of the Supreme Court justices who are considered liberal were nominated by Democratic presidents. And all of the justices who are considered conservative were nominated by Republican presidents. Right? We used to have Justice White, nominated by President Kennedy, who was considered quite conservative on a number of issues. This division, all the liberal justices appointed by Democrats, all the conservative justices appointed by Republicans, increases partisan perceptions of the court. It's not the conservative justices that did it, it's the Republican justices that did it, right? It's not that these justices are consciously voting to favor the party of their president. And those who say that, I think, don't understand how the Supreme Court works. Rather, it's that these justices are chosen for nomination by presidents precisely because their jurisprudential views line up with what the president's ideology is. So you nominate a Justice Alito or a Justice Sotomayor knowing what you're going to get, and that lines up with the interests of each party. In the next Bush versus Gore, should the United States be unlucky enough to have one, we cannot expect that the justices on the Supreme Court will be able to view the election law issues through neutral lenses. Instead, their worldviews and positions on the ultimate merits of who should be president is likely to subconsciously affect how they approach their cases. And it seems likely that these justices would divide along ideological and partisan lines. This new sharp division, which goes beyond election law issues to issues such as abortion rights, gun rights, race, congressional power, explains why the two political parties are fighting so hard over the replacement of Justice Scalia with Judge Merrick Garland. And we are likely to see continued fighting as additional vacancies open up over the next 4 to 8 years. And let me just say a word, not in my prepared remarks, but about what happens if we have Clinton versus Trump this time around. Then we can expect the court to divide 4 to 4, leaving whatever lower court happened to get the decision in the driver's seat. What if one of those courts is a federal appeals court and one is a state Supreme Court, and they reach conflicting decisions? We could have a constitutional crisis. It's a good way to get the heart going in the morning. But I imagine at some point we will have a 9-justice Supreme Court, and so we'll only have to deal with the problems of partisanship and ideology I've discussed. In sum, we in the United States now face a different confluence of two factors. First, the Supreme Court of the United States has great power over the rules and structure of American elections, from money in politics to legislative districts to voting rights, and the basic question of who gets to exercise the franchise and when they can do so. Second, the justices on the Supreme Court have different views on these constitutional questions, views which increasingly line up not only with the ideology of the justices, but also with their apparent partisan affiliations. Before long, we will think of justices regularly in more partisan terms and think of the Supreme Court as a Democratic Party or Republican Party-dominated institution. This will be especially true if justices are inconsistent across cases, as Justice Scalia arguably was when he played up the danger of incumbency protection when it came to campaign finance, but not when it came to redistricting. The convergence of a court with great power over election rules and an increasing partisan divide between liberal and conservatives over how to resolve election cases means that there will be stress on both the United States electoral system and on the legitimacy of the Supreme Court itself. As election rules shift with Supreme Court majorities, and it becomes harder for the public to avoid seeing justices as making political rather than legal decisions. And so I think we're entering into a dangerous period for American democracy, and I just hope that more people can pay attention not only to the presidential election, but to how that election is going to shape the next Supreme Court. Thank you very much.
Testing. Okay, so we have about 5 or 6 minutes for questions. If anybody has a question for Dr. Hasen, please raise your hand. Somebody from our team will come around, and we want to make sure, because we're recording this, we want to make sure we get your voice on. So we'll start over here, and then we'll go to that side of the room.
My name is Bruce Wright. I teach 5th grade in elementary school, obviously. Just going on what you just said at the end then. So the Warren Court was seen as a very activist court that was very political. So how do you see that different than this danger that you're talking about now?
Well, I think it's a great question. I think every court has been political when it comes to constitutional questions. Justice Kagan recently gave an interview where she was, Justice Elena Kagan, the newest justice on the Supreme Court, where she was explaining how the justices in their meetings, they have weekly meetings after oral argument in cases, how they decide cases. And she said on the less hot button issues, they sit around for a long time and they hash it out. But on the really difficult questions, it's very brief. Now, why is that? That's because on the easier questions, the more technical questions, what does this bankruptcy law mean? How do you interpret the tax code? The justices are doing the job of applying precedents and extending precedents, and there's not a lot of heat, there's much more agreement. But when it comes to the most difficult constitutional questions, the justices are inevitably making value judgments. That's because the Constitution, when it says something like equal protection or due process, it doesn't tell us exactly what that means, and the justices have different views as to how to decide those issues, views that tend to line up with different ideologies. That's always been true. That was true in the Warren Court, that was true in the Berger Court, that was true in the Rehnquist Court, and it's true in the Roberts Court. What's different now is that the Supreme Court is not only ideologically divided, as it has been, it is divided along party lines. Because back at the time of the Warren Court, you remember, it was the Republican Party that was pushing civil rights. And Democrats, you had all these Southern Democrats who were opposed to, for example, desegregation. So we've had political courts before, but we haven't had it lining up with partisanship. And so I think that's especially dangerous. And who knows, suppose we get a Hillary Clinton and as a president, and we have a Republican Senate. Will they confirm one of her nominees? Will there be 8 justices on the Supreme Court? Will we go down to 7 or 6? I mean, so it's such a partisan time now, and when the court is seen as a partisan institution, I think that presents extra special dangers that we haven't had before. It's not that they're more political than before, but it's that it has a partisan veneer that it's never had before, or not in recent times.
Hi, my name is Kami. I'm with procon.org. Thank you for your talk. It's so fascinating. I was curious to what degree do you believe that the partisanship in the court is a reflection of our current culture, and to what degree do you believe that it is something that can be addressed, perhaps with an amendment or changing some of the rules of the court?
So I don't think that there's much we could do to make the justices less ideological. I don't think there are neutral principles that justices can apply. I think what ends up happening is the Supreme Court, with a lag, reflects the views of the prior presidential and Senate elections. My solution to how to deal with this problem is one that I think actually some conservatives and liberals both agree on, which is term limits on the Supreme Court. 18-year term limits. There's no, and that would require a constitutional amendment. There's no reason that Justice Kennedy, and I'm picking on him because he's been the swing justice, not because he's any better or worse than the other justices, should have so much power for so many years over what our rules are and everything. You pick the hot button issue from same-sex marriage to gun rights to abortion to Obamacare. You pick the issue, so I think that would lower the stakes, and that might give room for more compromise. But it's very hard in this atmosphere to see anything that could be done, for example, to pick more neutral judges. So Chief Justice Roberts, when he was up for nomination, analogized judges to calling balls and strikes. And it's more like each judge gets to decide where the strike zone is and then gets to call balls and strikes. So it's a much harder than just looking at rules that are set and applying them.
Good morning. My name is Ruth Luovnos. I'm from Holmes Middle School, and I had a question for you regarding the gerrymandering that we're seeing in a lot of the school districts in the country, and if that is a reflection of what we see in the political process that a lot of school districts, especially the large school districts, have every year. Every time they get a new superintendent or a new leader, they change the districts. And so, we're seeing this in a lot of districts in California across the country. Is that a reflection of what's happening politically? Because we're now seeing it with school districts as well, where certain schools are being cut out of certain school districts.
I'm sure that you, talk to the mic. I'm sure that you all in this room know much more about that topic than I do. I don't know much about how school districts are divided up and what schools fit in what districts. But what I can say generally is that when you give people who are affected by decisions power over those decisions, they tend to make self-interested choices. And so if you're going to give the superintendent the power to decide where lines are going to be, you can expect, and I'm not saying any particular superintendent, but you give a decision maker the power, they're going to choose something that's going to be to their advantage. And so then the question is there some way to limit that? And one way to limit that, of course, would be through legislation and going to the state legislature. And the other sometimes is to the courts. And, America is a very litigious society. I'm sure you've all seen the Vergara litigation, right? So if you don't like something, the natural reaction is not necessarily to litigate it, but to go to court. And we use our courts to deal with these problems, and sometimes they do a better job than others.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions this morning, but I want to thank you very much, Professor Hasen, for speaking with us.